Lovely to see you all. This is the, hopefully you're in the right place. This is the NIHR ARC North Thames ECR Network webinar about conducting focus groups using digital platforms. And we'll give you, obviously we'll have a few more minutes while people are still joining us. So we'll just sort of give a kind of general introduction and some housekeeping rules during that time. So we can move forward as swiftly as possible, make sure we have a good finish at 11:30. So I'd like to welcome all of you, and in particular our speakers for today, who are Holly Walton and Anna Collum, and they're going to be speaking about their experiences of conducting focus groups using digital platforms. And I'll be introducing them a bit more later on after I go through some of the housekeeping. Just to note, I'm sure you all got the notification, but just to say that this session is being recorded, so if there are any issues with that, please let us know. If you do have any technical difficulties, I don't know if you can see Charles's face, he's on the corner there, and you can message him directly if you have any technical difficulties in the chat, and obviously, or in the chat generally, and we can pick them up. And I also just wanted to quickly draw your attention as well to the hashtag and the sort of Twitter account in the bottom corner of the screen. So our hashtag for the event is ARCUCR. So if you would like to just say, hey, I'm here, or shout out about some of the things you've learned today, please feel free to do so. We love to hear from you and hear how things have gone. The final thing, I probably should have actually introduced myself and Kat a little bit more properly as well before we continue and introduce Holly and Anna. So my name's Ruth Blackett and I'm a research fellow at UCL. And along with Kat, I'm co-chair of the NIHR ARC North Thames ECR committee. And we run a lot of these kind of webinars aimed at developing ECR skills and sharing learning and experiences. And this series has actually it's a sort of a final instalment of a series that our colleague Anna Dorick started, which is looking at how we adapt qualitative research methods during the pandemic and using digital methods to help us do this. So in our first session, we talked about how we could do interviews using digital platforms. And in the second, we looked at using social media to conduct data analysis. So this session follows on really nicely, I think, from there, and is more focused on the challenges about focus groups. So I think we can begin by introducing Holly. So Holly is a research fellow in the Department of Applied Health Research at UCL. So she graduated with a BSc in psychology from Nottingham Trent University and has an MSc in health psychology from UCL, as well as a PhD in health psychology from UCL. So Holly's research interests include implementation of complex interventions and healthcare services, and in particular, in the delivery and engagement of care coordination and behaviour change. So Holly will be discussing the lessons learned from conducting virtual focus groups in the Concord study. So I will stop sharing my screen, Holly, and allow you to take over.
Thank you, Ruth. So I'm just sharing my PowerPoint now. So hopefully all of you can see that. So as Ruth mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about conducting virtual focus groups. Just to flag, this presentation will be very practical, so I've tried to keep it sort of based on my personal experience of conducting virtual focus groups, what works well, and some kind of key tips and considerations to think about when conducting your own virtual focus groups. So please feel free to tweet if you'd like to, that's fine by me. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about my experiences of virtual focus groups and very briefly other remote methods as well. I'm going to briefly touch on face-to-face versus remote focus groups. And then we're going to go into some more practical slides on preparing for remote focus groups and delivering remote focus groups. To start with my experience. So as Ruth mentioned, for the past couple of years, I've been the Qualitative Research Fellow on the Coordinated Care of Rare Diseases project, and this is a mixed method study. And as part of Concord, we held online focus groups as part of 2 of the studies, and other methods were also used alongside the focus groups. But I'm just going to focus on the focus groups today. So the first study was a scoping review, and in the scoping review, we aimed to define care coordination for rare conditions. And in this scoping review, we answered the following questions. What does coordinated care mean? What does coordinated care look like? And do findings apply to rare conditions? Now, to answer the first two questions, we did a scoping review of 154 published review papers, but we found that most of the papers were based on chronic conditions. So then we wanted to hold some focus groups with people living with rare conditions, carers of people with rare conditions, and healthcare professionals working with rare conditions to find out whether those findings apply in rare conditions as well. So we held 3 focus groups. Now, this was before the pandemic, so we held 2 of those focus groups face-to-face, and we held 1 of them remotely. And the focus groups lasted for 2 hours, and we used Skype for Business for the remote focus group for this one. Now, the second study that I'm going to draw experiences from is taxonomy development. So in Concord, we aim to develop a way of outlining different ways of coordinating care for people living with rare, ultra rare and undiagnosed conditions. And this is called a taxonomy. It's basically a big table which outlines different ways of coordinating care. And there were 2 stages to this research. So in the first stage, we conducted 30 interviews with healthcare professionals, commissioners and charity representatives, and these were over the telephone or face-to-face if participants wanted them to be. And we also conducted 4 focus groups with patients and carers. Now, 2 of these again were face-to-face because it was pre-pandemic, but 2 of them were also remote. So we did 2 of them on Skype for Business. And these focus groups were quite lengthy, so they were 3 hours in total. We had a lot to cover, but lots of lessons learned and lots of kind of practical tips on how to sort of conduct these. And I think what I wanted to draw on in this presentation is the fact that I've recently had experience of both face-to-face focus groups and remote focus groups. So when putting together this presentation, I really tried to think hard about kind of the differences between them and kind of what the challenges were and what the benefits were of both of those. There was also a second stage to the study, which was online workshops. So we actually wanted to hold these face-to-face, but we ended up holding them online due to the pandemic, which came around the time of these workshops. So I'm not focusing on workshops today, but if anyone does want to ask about online workshops as well in the Q&A, then we can go into that in more detail. So the first section of this presentation will focus on face-to-face versus remote focus groups. And you might be wondering why we used both face-to-face and remote focus groups in the Concord studies. And I think part of the reason that we did this was because we wanted to ensure that as many people could come to the focus groups as possible. So we were kind of very aware that if we held face-to-face focus groups in cities, for example, not everybody would be able to come, not everybody might be able to travel, especially if they have a health condition that limits their travel, for example, or for childcare or work purposes, it might just not be possible. So in addition to the face-to-face focus groups, we made the decision to hold some online ones as well. I didn't know how timely this would be at the time when we did some online focus groups, but it's turned out good preparation for the following month, so it's worked out quite well. But also I think it kind of meant that we managed to recruit a range of participants. So we also managed to recruit those who might not have felt comfortable attending a face-to-face focus group, or those that just felt more confident attending via sort of a computer rather than in person. So when I was thinking about this, I put together some benefits and challenges of remote focus groups and face-to-face focus groups. And these are not in any way exhaustive, but just to give you an idea on the thinking around the benefits and challenges that I thought of. So the benefits of remote focus groups and the cons of remote focus groups. So for the benefits, I think that remote focus groups can enable you to have a wider reach and can enable people to access focus groups more readily. They might even hold the possibility for more anonymity for participants. So if participants don't feel comfortable attending a face-to-face focus group, Actually, online ones might give them more confidence because they don't have to have their camera on. There's slightly different parameters around what involvement means online versus in person. So they don't have to show up and say, hi, I'm so-and-so. They can show up and say, hi, I'm so-and-so, but they don't have to put their camera on if they don't want, and they can sort of choose how much information that they would like to share about themselves. Also, which I think is an important one for all of us, remote focus groups potentially have less research costs. You don't have to pay for a room to hold the focus groups in. There's less travel costs. So I think that's a really big benefit of remote focus groups as well. In terms of the cons, there is the potential for technology issues during the focus group and also when setting up the focus group, but we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail shortly. They might not be suitable for everybody. So as I've mentioned, not everybody might be comfortable using a computer. This is one of the cons of remote focus groups. You might not reach everyone that you intend to reach if you only do remote focus groups. But I think people are becoming more confident with technology, so hopefully in time this might become less of a con. We'll have to see what happens. And the other con that I think of is that there's potentially less chance for informal conversation. So you don't get there sort of 10 minutes before, you don't have a chance to speak to the other participants. You don't get a chance to build that rapport to say, you know, how was the train journey? What's the weather like today? You know, and even the breaks online are not as kind of sociable as kind of an in-person focus group where you might have some food, you might have a drink, you know, you might have a chat over tea or coffee or orange juice. So I think that's a potential disadvantage. In terms of face-to-face, I think the benefits are that it's a slightly more streamlined research process. So I think there is something about remote focus groups which mean that the consent process can be slightly more challenging, but we'll come on to that in a second. And also recruitment can be slightly more complex due to this. The face-to-face focus groups do not rely on technological ability, which is good, and they also enable us to build rapport and informal conversations. It's kind of the opposite of the remote focus groups. In terms of cons, there is always the potential for travel issues. So we've all probably been stuck on a train somewhere, delayed, not able to get to where we want to be. And it's potentially not always accessible for all. So it's not always possible to travel, and we can't hold face-to-face focus groups everywhere. We have to choose where we hold them, and that obviously comes at a cost for some participants. There's also potentially more research costs. So you have to pay for travel, obviously, catering, the room, and it's sort of making sure that everybody gets reimbursed for attending the focus group is really important. So I was thinking, what would help to choose whether you do it face-to-face or remotely? And I think obviously the pandemic is a large factor at the moment, but if we think about when hopefully things get back to slight normality, I think some considerations include, what are you aiming to achieve from the focus groups? So if, for example, you want to do some activities in the focus group and you want to kind of move some cards around, that obviously might be slightly more easy in a face-to-face focus group than an online one, although not impossible. If you're sort of hoping to have a chat about a topic, but you don't necessarily want that informal chat necessarily as important, then I think you can kind of make a decision based on that question. And the other one is, who are your focus groups aimed at? So if you have people who may not be able to travel, who may not be confident traveling, who may be very digitally able, then I think technologically remote focus groups may work very well. If you've got a population who may not be as familiar with online focus groups or who may not be as confident with technology, then you may want to think about face-to-face. I think having done a mixture of both for our studies, I think that worked really well, and I think we got slightly different groups of participants in both of those focus groups, which meant that our sample was quite diverse. So I think if you can do a mixture of both, it's potentially helpful, but obviously you've got to work within the restraints of everything else. So I think be practical as well and be pragmatic in what you do. So now I'm going to go through some tips very quickly for preparing for and running remote focus groups. So the first one that I want to go through is a bit about ethics. There are some considerations that I think we need to think about when running and preparing for focus groups. So you need to think about the platform used and whether it meets ethical and governance requirements. So there's lots of online focus group platforms. There's Teams, there's Zoom, which we're on at the moment. There was Skype for Business. There probably is still Skype for Business. So have a think about whether your university, your organisation has any requirements for the platform that you use, whether that has any implications on the ethical application, and have a think about what you need to use it for as well. If it's just that you're using it like this and not necessarily recording it, it might be okay to use certain ones but not others. So have a think about that carefully. We did use Skype for Business because that was what was recommended when we were doing this project, but then we actually moved to Zoom for the online workshops. So have a think about what works for you. Think about how you will obtain consent. So there's different options, some of them being verbal consent versus pre-focus group written consent. So I've done both. So for the scoping review, we went through our university ethics, and verbal consent was fine. So at the start of the focus group, we asked all of the participants to confirm that they were happy with the items on the consent form. They all received the consent form in advance of the focus group, and then we took verbal consent on the recording so that we knew that they were happy to take part. For the taxonomy elements of the study, we went through HRA and NHS ethics, and we had to obtain written consent for those. So we had to send the consent form to participants before the interview, and then we had to say, please can you send it back to us as soon as possible, but before the focus group. And this did lead to some challenges because not everybody sends them back, and it can be quite hard to chase those. So I think do think about that. We did mitigate this slightly by not sending them the link to the focus group until we'd received the written consent, because obviously if you imagine if we give them the link to the focus group and they turn up, we can't then remove their data if they haven't consented. So there are some challenges around that, so think about how you will sort of manage that. Think about how you'll manage data and anonymity. So you might want to ask participants at the start of the focus group not to reveal the identities of other participants and to keep it confidential. And you might want to think about how you will manage the recording. So will you record using a dictaphone, or will you record using the online teleconferencing software? We chose to record using an external encrypted dictaphone for a few different reasons. So one, it was easier in terms of making sure that we had control of where that recording was. So some of the teleconferencing systems might record to the cloud, for example, which we didn't feel was appropriate for our study. So we made decisions based on that, but do have a think carefully about that. In terms of recruitment, it's similar issues to face-to-face focus groups. You might want to think about whether you're going to specify a date or whether you're going to see which date most of your participants can do. We did the first one, so we made a set number of dates, and we then asked participants to say if they could come to those dates. You might want to think about how you're going to reach your target population, and you want to think about what if remote virtual focus groups are not suitable for all of your participants that you recruit. Will you offer interviews instead? Will you offer a face-to-face focus group? So do have a think about that when working on your focus groups. And do try to give plenty of time between the recruitment and the focus group. So as I've mentioned, the consent processes do take a bit of time. So try to make sure that you account for that when planning your focus groups. And consider recruiting more participants than needed. So often people might drop out, and this is something that we've got to be really aware of. And it might be that on the day of your focus group, people just don't turn up. So I think just be sort of aware of that if possible. So yeah, as I mentioned, consider recruiting more participants than needed. So often people don't turn up. So you think you've got 8 participants and then you only end up with 4. And this can be quite disappointing when you think you've kind of recruited all the people you need and then you don't quite have everyone. So that's a consideration that I would definitely recommend. And account for technical considerations when deciding how many in each group. So for a face-to-face focus group, I would recommend, and the literature recommends, between 6 to 8 people, and this works really well. with a remote focus group, sometimes less is probably better, because actually it's quite hard to go around everyone and make sure that everyone gets a say. So you might want to think about having less people in your focus group if you do a remote one. In terms of logistics and planning, send participants an email with the necessary information beforehand, and I've put some ideas on the screen here. So step-by-step instructions, for example. Prepare the participants for re-expectation. So if they need to be in a quiet place with an internet connection, it's good to just make sure that they know that beforehand. And plan in plenty of time to answer participants' queries about the technology and the consent forms in advance of the focus group as well. And make sure that your recording equipment works. So as with a face-to-face one, make sure you test this beforehand. And you might want to do a sort of mock focus group beforehand to try the software. So get some of your friends to come and join a group just to check that it all works. During the focus group, try and plan to have someone available to answer technical queries on the day and time of the focus group. It's very difficult to answer phone calls when you're also trying to run a focus group and introduce everyone to the setting. So try and make sure that you have someone who can help with that if needed. Try and ask participants to join the focus group 5 to 10 minutes before in case of any technical difficulties. And have a backup laptop and plan in case the computer does have any problems. So I did have this with one of mine, where the computer just wouldn't work, and I had to log on a different device and explain to participants that I would be right back, but that we were trying to sort this out. So just be mindful of that and make sure that your dictaphone is charged. And then very quickly, in terms of conducting the focus group, I think it's a good idea to have multiple researchers with clear roles. So I think it's good to have one person who asks the questions and one person who takes notes and notes down anything that you might not yet have covered. Try and do a briefing, an introduction, and some ground rules or focus group etiquette to make sure that everyone's on the same page of what's expected and sort of what to do in the focus group. Use a clear and structured topic guide, and I think add timings to this, and I think this is really important for online ones. It's really easy to forget what time it is, so try to make sure that you're kind of sticking to the plan as much as possible and covering everything that you need to cover. And try and give everyone a chance to speak. And online this can be quite hard because not everyone might have their camera on. So you might have to actually go around and say, Ruth, have you got anything to add? Sylvia, have you got anything to add? What's your thoughts on that? And kind of make sure that you're sort of facilitating that role. And give participants a break in the middle. Screen time can be quite tiring, so that's always helpful. And then make sure to do a debrief at the end. I thought it would be really helpful to end on a slide just to give you some ideas of what to cover in the focus group etiquette. So introduce yourself and other researchers, give the aim of the focus group and how long it will take. Make sure that everyone's familiar with the mute, video and chat functions and how you're going to use them. And ask if anyone has any questions, double check they're all still happy to take part. Make sure that you're recording the focus group. Make sure to explain about anonymity, confidentiality and withdrawal. Explain that there's no right or wrong answers and that you value hearing different views. And make sure you give the role of you as a researcher, that you're moderating and not there to contribute. So you're saying sort of, Ruth, would you like to tell us your views on that? Rather than saying, Ruth, this is my views on that, what you've just said, and kind of, so make sure you're kind of moderating but not contributing too much. So thank you for listening, and I'm so sorry about the dog disruption in the middle. And does anyone, well, I think we're taking questions later, so we'll keep those to the end, but thank you all.
Thank you very much, Holly. That was brilliant. Thank you. And no problem at all. You do have an adorable dog. So I'm just sad we didn't get to see him. My only sadness. But thank you so much. That's really useful and really great presentation. And yes, we'll take some questions just after Anna's presentation. So I will introduce Anna now. And Anna, if you can start to sharing your screen, that would be great. So Anna Collum is a PhD candidate at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the Open University. So her research applies a feminist intersectional approach to exploring how mobile technologies, in particular access and use of WhatsApp, mediates the citizenship capabilities of young women in Western Kenya. So prior to her PhD at the Open University, Anna worked for BBC Media Action as a senior research manager, designing and conducting research to inform and evaluate the role of media and communications in social change across countries in Africa and Asia. She's also worked as a researcher for the London School of Economics and Political Science and consulted for a number of international organisations. And Anna completed her MSc in Development Studies from SOAS, and she also holds a degree in journalism and is a trained participatory video facilitator and documentary filmmaker. So it'd be lovely to hear from you, Anna. You can take it away whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. And yeah, great presentation from Holly, and interesting that we coincide in so many points. So that's really good to see in terms of how the evidence on online focus groups is evolving and being built. So that's really great. Thanks also for the invite. It's really good to be here and be able to share my learning. As Ruth has said, I'm a PhD candidate. Almost there, but not finished yet. I'm doing a PhD in politics, looking at citizenship capabilities in Kenya and the role of technologies in that. So as part of the methodology, I used a focus group using WhatsApp, and I'll explain now why and how it went about. So yeah, I'll talk about the context of this method, so the research study, then I'll talk about the temporal and spatial flexibility of online focus groups, especially in WhatsApp, and the ethics that come with this. And then I'll present 3 key affordances of using WhatsApp, and I'll just highlight again some of the risks and disadvantages, and then you'll have the reference list. The paper I wrote on that goes into all the detail on how I went about it, and it's open access as well. So this is a capture, so you can just search it online and you'll find it quickly. So the context of the research study, the main research question of my PhD really is on how ICTs influence the citizenship capabilities of young people, and that's specifically in Western Kenya. So what I did was a digital ethnography, which means it looks both at offline and online spaces, and especially puts emphasis on how these spaces relate to each other as well. So digital ethnography does not mean only online research. It actually very much refers to both offline and online spaces and how they interact with each other. So this included semi-structured interviews face-to-face, also offline or face-to-face observations in different events and trainings that the young people were taking part in. I also was observing in 3 different WhatsApp groups that the young people were part of as part of their activism. Then I did a focus group discussion on WhatsApp, which is what I'll talk about. I also had a fieldwork diary and a secondary data. So just to put into context, what I'm talking about is only about this specific method, not the overall study. So why WhatsApp? The first thing to say is that it's, of course, a mobile method. It's very familiar to many people and it's ubiquitous. So, you know, people can be on the group from wherever they are. And even if they are not at home or in an office, they can access it. It's a lot more flexible in this sense. And here, I would like to highlight that there are other instant messaging platforms that I would have been more comfortable using because of its ethics, like Signal. But however, yet in most contexts, Signal does not offer this ubiquity and familiarity that WhatsApp offers, especially in Kenya. In Kenya, WhatsApp is really widely accessed. People use it for meetings, for all sorts of things, not only to chat with friends and family. So it was particularly relevant in that context, and it might not be relevant in other contexts, or you might prefer to use other platforms or instant messaging applications. So related to this mobility and ubiquity, WhatsApp offers a certain level of ecological validity in the sense that it is, as I said, the main form of online communication among internet users in Kenya, and especially the young people that I was working with. They were mainly mobilizing and engaging and communicating with each other via WhatsApp already. So that made a lot of sense at that point. Made of communication among the participants as well. And also it's a communication space and genre that is already part of participants' daily communicative habits. So there's a language that's developed already when you talk in WhatsApp, and there's an etiquette already. So it was a space that was familiar to them rather than imposed by me in a way. And here's just 2 references that from the online focus groups literature that refer to this ecological validity. Even if you look at the second quote from Hinchcliffe and Gavin, 2009, that was before many of the platforms we have now. And even then, they referred to instant messaging as an integral part of university life, which raised the ecological validity of the study that they were doing. So this only has become even more and more relevant with mobile instant messaging. Then Holly also referred to that there's practicalities in terms of the cost and the ability to bring participants together in one place. As Holly said as well, if I had organized a face-to-face focus group, first I wouldn't be able to afford it. I wouldn't have been able to do that, but also many people wouldn't have been able to come, even if I covered the transportation and other costs. It was just not possible. People had responsibilities, whether it was school or working in the farm or taking care of family members. So yeah, that was quite important in that context. And related to that, it's also adapting to participants' time. So if you use a mobile method, it allows you to fit it in with other schedules or competing priorities and allow people to take part in their own terms. So the focus group, the participants were aged between 18 to 35 years old. There were 10 participants who already knew each other, and I think that's quite important, and I'll talk about this later, but when using WhatsApp, because of ethics and privacy, I think it's quite important that participants already have trust that they've built with each other, or they are comfortable already talking to each other, and I think that's why I highlight in the paper that it's particularly perhaps suitable for participatory methods more than other approaches. And the third point, the one in the middle, is the length of the focus group. That's, I know, very unusual. Focus groups tend to last between 1 to 2 hours maximum. These lasted a day, 24 hours since I closed, until I closed the group, but the discussion itself lasted a normal working day. We started at, I think it was 9 a.m. and by 6 or so, there were no more discussions, but I still left it open so that people who had reflections could add them in the group. And I'll talk about this as well in terms of the asynchronicity, as well as the synchronicity of the discussion. So yeah, I wanted to refer to this temporal and spatial flexibility, which is, in this case, it was a key affordance, but it also comes with specific ethics considerations. So one thing is the internet use and access. So it's important to ensure that the levels of internet and WhatsApp access and use are relevant in the context where you're working in and with the participants. In my case, actually, it was relevant to compensate participants for the cost of data, because in that context in Kenya, many young people, not everyone has a smartphone to start with, or WhatsApp. The ones I was working with generally had it, but not on an ongoing basis. So they would rely on buying data bundles, which you buy a few megabytes and they last you for 2 days or 3 days, and then you are offline for a little bit. So access for some of them was quite intermittent. So it was important to cover the costs of data. And I know that's very specific to the context. It might not apply to many other areas. Another important point that's highlighted by the online research ethics literature is the dialogic and recursive approach to online research ethics. So this means that it has to be repeated and highlighted and also agreed in a way, because everyone takes responsibility really on many social media or instant messaging platforms for privacy. The researcher loses control on how much data can be protected. So it's important to take this approach. So in my case, consent and ethical commitment were sought both one-to-one first, and then if given, then they went again reminded in the group setting. During the consent seeking stage, different channels were used for some participants other than WhatsApp. So for some of them that I knew, because we had been engaging already as part of the research, that they might not have data on their phones, that I would call them or send them an SMS or offer them to give a missed call so that I could call back if they were willing to continue through the consent process. And then the ethical commitments were repeated twice during the focus group after the group discussion started as well. So I think instant messaging really requires to be very, very careful and be very clear about the importance of ethics. And that's partly because of the need for collective responsibility for privacy. Individuals need to be aware of the risks of data being in other people's phones, including the phone numbers, and the group needs to take responsibility for everyone's privacy. There are some applications that exist nowadays for instant messaging that do not link to the phone number, so they can be used without participants having to see other participants' numbers, but they are yet very rare. And it would have required, in this case, asking participants to download an app, it could totally not be appropriate in that case because of the data costs, and it just felt like imposing something that's not familiar to participants. And this is also another reason why I think this method it's particularly appropriate for participatory action research, where participants already know each other, they are comfortable sharing details, or they have already been sharing their details, even they might already be engaging in WhatsApp. If you want to do a focus group with participants who do not know each other or with sensitive topics, I probably would choose another method, to be honest, where you can have more control. Okay, so advantages in this case, because in some cases, in this case, it was useful, and there's been a couple other papers that have used WhatsApp, which have been really interesting, and you can really see the value of the method. But they tend to be more participatory approaches, or if not participatory contexts in which participants know each other, and there's this level of confidence in the ethics. So these are aspects that Holly actually has mentioned already as well. So the first affordance is on enabling these inclusive conversations. In terms of first, the disembodied experience, Holly talked about the anonymity, but also even when participants know each other's names, there's already mentioned in the literature a level of anonymity that's not actual anonymity, but yeah, a certain level of comfort that you are not really there face to face. You don't have to see each other. You can choose what you say and how much you interject. And that's a quote from other research in Kenya as well that talks about how the physical distance created by social media offers a comfortable environment in which participants find it easier to discuss topics that they might feel uncomfortable discussing face to face. The second, which I found in my research, was also perception of freedom attached to WhatsApp. There was this view that even over SMS and definitely over face-to-face communication, that you could say what you wanted without fear, that everyone was free to share their opinion. And also quite relevant to that context in which young people in Kenya feel many public spaces of discussion are reserved for more adult groups, and they don't feel they have a voice. So in this case, young people felt WhatsApp was a space for them, where they could be themselves and felt they did have a voice. So that's another advantage of using that method in this context. And then there's an aspect of multilingual writing. There's been some research, for example, by Deumert, which argues that text messaging in Africa, including social media, instant messaging, offers new ways of writing locally, as well as shaping a digitally mediated Pan-African voice. And actually, this really was very obvious in the focus of discussion. So participants, although it was in English, the discussion, participants would sometimes throw in some sentences on words in Kiswahili or Sheng, which is a mixed English and Swahili language. For example, in this quote, make them change their perception and realize that vijana ndio viongozi wa sasa ni sio kesho as perceived, means that young people are the leaders of today and not of tomorrow as perceived. So the fact that participants were comfortable mixing languages, for me, it was quite reassuring in terms of them feeling that that was a space where they could be quite free. Just checking the time, sorry. Great, the second affordance is on combining synchronous and asynchronous interactions. And that's where the long full day focus group discussion comes in, which is possible because of the mobile nature of the method. So with WhatsApp, people could text in while they are at work or while they are at home, or maybe while they are in the bus, for example. But they could also, if I took a longer approach than an hour or an hour and a half, it meant that they could come back and maybe after working and look at what the discussion was and then contribute later on. Or maybe they could just let the conversation happen for a bit and reflect on what was being said and maybe construct their answer in a more reflective way. So there was a mix of more dynamic synchronous discussions and asynchronous discussions. In terms of the synchronous discussions, the literature has already highlighted that they tend to offer a more chaotic transcript characterized by real-time threading, for example, in the case of the study by Fox, Morris, and Ramsey. You don't need to read that. This is an excerpt of the focus group transcript. It's just so you can see that that was a synchronous interaction. You can see the shortness of the sentences and the various interjections from different participants. So that was an example of a synchronous moment, and they were the majority. It tended to be quite I was basically on the phone all day, even if not participants were talking all day. So there were many moments of synchronicity, except for the breaks we had agreed, like lunch break, etc. And then, especially during the synchronous discussions, you can really see that it's a linguistic genre on its own, shorter words, emojis. There's written ways of representing nonverbal cues and multilingual writing, as I said. And this has been covered in the literature already as well, on the shorter word and sentence length. And then in terms of the asynchronous discussions, they were more reflected, constructed interactions. For example, this is again a quote. Someone came in onto a topic later on after it was introduced and said, "This is my take on this. It is worth noting that many youths volunteer when it comes to civic engagement. However, most young people," and then it went on for 3 paragraphs. You can see by the use of words that it's a lot more constructed, the use of adverbs, and it's a lot more constructed sentence. But this has advantages as well. It facilitates the co-research process, as Williams et al. Argued in 2012, because both of them have time to reflect, but also myself as a researcher had time to see what was coming out, whether I had to probe for something, or whether there were aspects that I had not really included in my topic guide, but which I wanted to raise later on. It then facilitates inclusion of more voices. So if someone was not available in the morning, they could pick it up in the afternoon and still have their say somehow. And then WhatsApp offered the advantage of using numbering and threading to signpost the conversation. So every time I introduced a topic or a question, I would number it, even use bold font, so that when they were scrolling up and down, they could more easily see what were the key topics and which one they wanted to contribute to, and they would use the threading to highlight which topic they were referring to. And finally, a 3 point I wanted to make is on the deliberative potential of WhatsApp discussions. I use a definition on deliberative discussions, which is a decision-oriented conversation in which a group weighs pros and cons of different options. Sorry, I can see my own, and makes choices in a way that is respectful, egalitarian, and open. So what I did in this case is I used discourse analysis on the focus group transcript to see whether there was any evidence of deliberation happening or not. I got a sense while I was facilitating the group discussion that there was, and that's why I did this research in addition to the analysis just presented. And I found these discursive patterns, the use of I versus we, the articulation of values, whether it was individually or as a group. There was moments of respect for other opinions, agreement and collaboration, asking others for clarification. In some cases, they were further developing someone else's comment or justifying an argument or an opinion. There was weighting of pros and cons, and also cases of suggesting a way forward. There were less instances of decision-making because that's not how I designed the guide. If it had been a participatory action research project and facilitated in a different way, that would have definitely been possible, I think. And these are just examples of this type of discursive patterns. For example, in my opinion, helping others is a virtue and it's something anyone should do, but constitutionally it's not a role, it's just an act of kindness and it's done out of goodwill, my opinion. And then you can see the emoji as well to reiterate that that's their view. And I think this is showing respect for others' opinions, so trying to make one's point, but also being clear that not everyone might agree with that. Concerned about the time, so there's other quotes, but you can read them later when the presentation is shared, or you can read the paper. It's open access and there's many there. I just wanted to remind everyone on the risks and the disadvantages. You can see a picture on the right-hand side. This is how some of the participants topped their data on the phones. So you buy these scratch cards, you pay maybe sometimes less than £1 in this case, for example, and you get 65 megabytes of data. So just, this is to make the point that not everyone had meaningful access to the internet. It was quite intermittent. And that's to make the point that using that could also exclude depending on where you use it. It might be less relevant in the UK, but in the UK, there's also often more than we think, parts of the population who do not have access to the internet or also intermittent access. So bear that in mind as well. And then there's also reasons that Holly has also mentioned, like literacy or digital literacy, people living with disabilities, and in the case of Kenya, as I said, intermittent access, whether it's due to the network or the cost of the smartphone or data, or other gender norms in the household, which were very relevant in that context as well. And then the privacy and data protection risks of instant messaging. I think this is very important, and that's why I would advise to use this in participatory research where participants know each other, are comfortable, are already sharing each other's numbers, and privacy can be collectively agreed. I think I've run out of time. Sorry, I can't see the comment. I don't know if I have time to go over the conclusions.
You've got 2 minutes, Anna, sorry.
Great, thank you, thank you. So yeah, this is just to wrap up. The first point to conclude on is that as the most used instant messaging application in the world and in many local contexts, WhatsApp's ubiquity in many people's lives offers high ecological validity and new avenues, I think, for qualitative research. So this paper makes the point on the potential it has for online and mobile focus groups discussions. This ubiquity can offer practical advantages related to cost and distance, and also be more inclusive by adapting to people's different realities, a point that Holly has also raised. Discussions also offer a disembodied experience, and for some a sense of freedom that can enable more inclusive conversations. I forgot to mention that in the focus group, half participants were identified as themselves as men and half as women, and the level of participation was equal pretty much. I counted the interjections and they were almost 50-50. But in the face-to-face observations I had been observing, that was less so the case. My perception was that women were a lot less likely to speak. And that's where, to me, it became very clear that WhatsApp really helped some participants, especially women, to be more outspoken. Discussions in WhatsApp can be seen as constituting a genre on its own and enabling more multilingual exchanges and various ways of communicating non-verbal cues that can be interpreted more systematically by the researcher. Its ecological validity enables an environment for deliberation, which can be particularly harnessed through appropriate facilitation, as I said, with, I think, great potential in participatory or action research. Digital access statistics hide more nuanced intermittent or mediated access related to literacy, cost, infrastructure, gender norms. So anyone who's planning to use WhatsApp would need to first assess that if ubiquity that I'm arguing here really applies to your context or not. As a mobile method, data lives in participants' phones, so other methods will be more appropriate if participants do not know each other, or the topic is sensitive, or there's issues with them agreeing collectively and committing to privacy. And combining synchronicity and asynchronicity enabled a combination of fast-paced and more constructed and reflective answers, which transcends the limitations often seen traditionally in online focus groups literature on using either approach in isolation. And the functional approaches of WhatsApp helps to manage both approaches using threading or signposting the conversation topics in different ways. And I'll leave it here. There's a reference list in the slides, but of course also a longer one in the paper. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. And so thank you to both Anna and Holly for really excellent presentations. You both gave everybody some practical tips and also described your experiences, which in terms of the context of your research and the platforms you use were both really different. So I don't think we could really ask for more in terms of a really well-rounded view of adapting focus groups for digital platforms and helping people to think about how they can do that moving forward with their research. So in terms of the rest of the session now, as Ruth alluded to at the beginning, we're now going to move to some questions for Anna and Holly, and we will facilitate that. So please do type in the chat if you would like to ask via that platform, or if you want to speak, then raise your hand. We're going to have the Q&A for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to move to just some smaller breakout groups so that we can really talk about our own experiences, whether we're planning to use focus groups, any challenges, and so we can just work in smaller groups. And then we'll just come back together for 5 minutes at the end to close. Just some things to flag before we launch into the questions are that, as you know, the session's being recorded. The breakout groups will not be recorded, but the recording will be available on the ARC ECR part of the ARC North Thames website, and will also be shared with you. We have also developed a summary document, and that will include links to the papers that Anna and Holly described, so the Concord paper and the Anna's WhatsApp study paper, and then also some links to other relevant studies that might be useful, and some of the things that Holly and Anna signposted to in their talk. So we will send those out after this session so that you can have those as well. So just to start off with the questions, I had a question just relating to kind of group dynamics. So you both described the kind of benefits and challenges of using your platforms to do focus groups. Are there anything specifically about managing group dynamics in that kind of virtual platform that you could talk to or talk about in relation to your projects?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there is a slightly different dynamic between face-to-face and remote focus groups. I think the biggest one is that in a face-to-face, you've got that chance to kind of have that informal conversation. So the participants have almost started to get to know each other before they're even in the focus group. Whereas online, it starts off quite quiet. And I think that kind of speaks to the really important aspect of the briefing and the introductions that I mentioned. So I think it's really good to give a briefing to kind of say, there's no right or wrong answers. Everyone can share their views despite whether it's, you know, the same as someone else's. And I think giving them the opportunity to go around and introduce themselves and kind of say what they want to say about who they are and where they're from and what experience they're bringing to focus group was quite helpful in kind of starting to build those dynamics. I think then, again, because people don't always have their cameras on online, I think there is more of a facilitative role from you as a researcher, because I think you do have to kind of do a bit of that work on, you know, so what's your views, does that, and then kind of asking someone else their views, because I think you've almost got to give people space to contribute. I think otherwise, to start with, people might not jump in. I think by the end of the focus group, people do jump in more. So I think it's kind of just giving people permission to kind of open up and speak if they'd like to. So I think if you're facilitating one for the first time, it might be a bit strange initially for you. So, but just feel free to kind of do ask people if they have anything to say. If they don't have anything to say, they'll say, no, I'm all right. I agree with the people, it's fine. But at least then you know that you've kind of covered that. I think that's what I would say on that.
Thanks, Holly. And Anna?
Yeah, what I would say on the dynamics for instant messaging specifically, what's quite tricky perhaps, or maybe needs consideration, is how to manage silences and how to show that you are listening. So you could use, for example, I would say thank you, and I would say I'm following, or I would even use emojis sometimes to show that I have, you know, I'm there and I'm listening. But at the same time, you have to be careful that your interjection to say that you are there listening doesn't send a signal that I'm kind of, okay, that's it, let's move to the next person, you know. So it's managing the silences. So sometimes I would just wait without saying anything to see if others wanted to chip in. So I think it's just mainly that. And the other one is on the synchronous and asynchronous discussion. So when someone comes in referring to a previous topic, just facilitating it so that still things are flowing and everyone's understanding that, you know, we are now back to that topic for a moment. So I think as a facilitator, you can help with everyone following the conversation if they are at that moment online.
Thank you. So lots of questions coming through on the chat. We were worried that people may not have questions to ask, but obviously this just shows how much of an appetite there is for kind of this topic, which is great. So if we just start with a question from Lorna about, and I think probably directed to you, Anna. So if WhatsApp is better with a group of participants who already know one another, what platform would you use to run a focus group with strangers?
I would say it depends on the context. So if it was with, for example, participants in the UK we're confident they'll have access to the internet and a computer or some sort of tech device, then I would probably use the approach that Holly has taken. If we want to take advantage of the mobile aspects and this kind of, you know, synchronicity versus asynchronicity and letting people chip in their own pace or maybe for longer than an hour and a half, then instant messaging, I think it's really, really valuable. You could still use WhatsApp, you know, if you go through, of course, the ethics processes at your university or the ethics processes that are required. But I would just, put a lot of attention on everyone being aware about the risks, that they agree or to their data being in other people's phones, and agreeing when you close the group, whether everyone's deleting it or whether they are happy for it to remain as a transcript for them, or, you know, so just being very clear from the beginning. So I wouldn't say you cannot use it. I would just say be very careful and clear on what happens. And then there's other instant messaging platforms. There's one, I'm just looking at a list that I found the other day called Me. I tried to download it in my phone and it didn't really actually work. It wouldn't let me sign up. So I don't know really how it works, but I know that it doesn't require to see the phone number, and it would allow you more control over what happens with the discussion. But again, the disadvantage of that is it's I don't think any of us know this platform. Probably I might be wrong, but it's not really, it doesn't have the advantages of ubiquity, familiarity, and, you know, the day-to-day use that WhatsApp could have. So yeah, I mean, I think this is an area of ongoing research to keep an eye on how instant messaging evolves and what other platforms are there, whether others like Signal become more and more used, which could be great in terms of, you know, issues of WhatsApp sharing data with Facebook and all of this, which, yeah, it's not really, I would prefer not to have to use that, to be honest, but in that context, it was the most appropriate.
Thank you. And I guess a quick side question from me based on that is, would it be okay if we kind of collated from both of you the kind of platforms that maybe you looked at when you were doing the research, so we can put them in a list in that summary document, so that people can look further into those themselves and then kind of come up with what is best for each context? Because I think, as you described throughout your kind of presentation, Anna, it's really about the context of that platform is really important to get the most out of the research. Thanks.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
So now moving on to a question for Holly. So I was a bit surprised that verbal consent was permitted. Is verbal consent generally considered acceptable for online focus groups? And how might you recommend collecting demographic information from participants in an online focus group?
Yeah, so good questions. I think the consent is a bit more difficult remotely, and I think I've kind of spoke to this a bit in the presentation. I think it depends on the ethics committee. So I know when we did the HRA NHS aspects of the study. We did obtain written consents. We used the consent form to do that. Even for the verbal consent, we still sent them the consent form, and we still went through the items and said, do you consent to all of these? Yes or no? I think we went through different ethics committees for both studies. So I wouldn't say that verbal consent would always be acceptable for online focus groups. And I think it gives more confidence if they have provided written consent. I think I prefer that method, but it is more tricky in terms of getting it from the participants before the online focus group. But I would say it does add, it's not so bad for interviews because it's one person, so you can make sure that the interview takes place after the consent form sent. But for focus groups, it can be more challenging because people might say, oh yeah, I'll send it before the focus group, but then you don't get it. So then what happens then? Do you then wait and say, send another prompt to say, can you send your consent form? And then if they don't, not send the link. So we decided not to send the link until we'd received the consent form, because we didn't want to be in that position where people come into the focus group and haven't consented. I would say check your ethics committee's guidance. So if you're going for the HRA, check that guidance. If you're going for the university ethics, check that guidance. It does differ slightly. But what I would say is be as thorough in your ethics application about your consent processes as possible, because they will tell you if there's any concerns with what you're proposing, and they will recommend it being done a different way. I would say that I think with the pandemic, the shift to verbal consent may be easing slightly. I think for some interviews, verbal consent might be happening now and things. So it might be changing over time anyway, but keep an eye on kind of the ethics guidance. I'm not an expert on that, so just to kind of say that. And then in terms of the demographic information, we did this as part of an eligibility process when they sort of expressed an interest in participating. So when they expressed an interest in participating, we sent them some questions about their demographics, and this helped us with our sampling. But like you say, it also helped us to know who was in the focus groups, and so we did that offline before the focus group, if that helps.
Thank you, Holly. So there are a few questions in the chat about consent, so I think we might come back and revisit that. And just to flag that because we're getting so many questions through, we thought that we may just stay together as a group and do some kind of facilitated discussion in that way, if that's okay with everybody. We're also happy, the committee members, to kind of hang back at the end. So if anyone has any specific questions about their projects that we can help signpost, we're happy to hang on at the end if anybody has specific questions. And then it's just a flag that Anna needs to pop off soon, so I might just go to one additional question that Anna might be able to help with, and then we'll come back to some of the other questions that are about the kind of focus groups that Holly described, and a few more questions about consent, if that's all right with everybody. Brilliant. So just a question here from Imogen about kind of the challenges of overcoming a pre-specified platform versus using what the participants the participants feel comfortable using.
Shall I go ahead then? I think, again, on that, it really depends on the context. If your participants are, a part of the population who won't really have a problem downloading an app or going into an online link, whether it's Zoom or another one, and even if they haven't used it before, they'll quickly just intuitively understand, then that's less of a problem to impose is not the right word, but to choose the platform that you think you can use because of your university rules or whatever. I think that's okay. In the context where I was working, there are really difficult power dynamics that come with research being done from Europeans in countries of the global south. So I was trying to really be very careful with the time I was taking from participants and the methods I was using and how much I was deciding how to go about, both platforms to use. So even doing a face focus group could have been possible because there were occasions where they were getting together and I was observing the interactions. But again, this felt like using some time that for them was very precious because it was not easy for them to get together often. So that's why I really, I really had to choose something that it was part of their daily lives and they were comfortable using to overcome all the barriers that I've mentioned before. But again, as I said, depending on the context, then it would not be a big challenge to just suggest a platform that works for you and your university.
Thank you, Anna. So I know you need to head off now. So just to say once again, thank you so much for your time and coming here to talk to us today about your research and to give some really great tips for those of us considering how we might adapt in this new kind of digital era. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them via email or have one-to-one calls if this helps. So just my email is in the paper and I'm sure it's going to be shared. So yeah, do not hesitate. Thank you so much. And sorry, I have to leave. Thank you.
And just to flag before I move on to some of the other questions, so Charles has just kindly posted in the chat a feedback form. We'd be really grateful if you could just spend 2 minutes, so follow the link and fill in that so that we can adapt and improve the ARC ECR network events moving forward. So any comments welcome, so please do take a minute or so to fill that in. So if we just come back and just there's 2 questions about consent, so I'm going to merge them together and Holly, spotlight's on you, but we can all help out and I'm thinking Sylvie particularly if you've got any thoughts on this as well. So still questions about consent. So one question kind of about consent with children. So someone's looking at evaluating an online child mental health and wellbeing intervention and would like to do focus groups digitally with children, and so whether verbal consent would be appropriate for that population.
So I honestly couldn't answer this question purely because all of my research has been with adults, some parents of children, but adults are the only people that I've spoken to. Sylvie, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I think that you probably would need to have written consent for the whole research project and then follow up verbal consent for the focus group. So if you were recruiting people into the study and parents and their children, then you could get written consent to participate in all stages of the research and then re-consent people verbally. But I think, again, I would go with Holly and say, firstly, see what the requirements are from your institution, and particularly in working with children, there might be additional consenting processes you need to consider, and so verbal consent might not be sufficient.
Yeah. There might be guidance on the HRA website about research with children, and also your university ethics should have some guidance. If not, you might be able to contact them to ask them for what their usual process would be in that situation. But my instinct would be with you, Sylvie, that it'd probably be written consent from the parents and then verbal consent for the focus group. But yeah, that's just a hunch.
Yeah, I think it's really challenging, and I think so if you're, as Holly said, with a university, the university ethics, or if you're with an NHS trust, the kind of research office or the governance team will usually be able to kind of provide some guidance. The question from Imogen is also about consent, which is about whether it would be possible to have consent via the chat function in digital focus groups, or whether HRA would prefer written consent.
Yeah, so again, this is a tricky one. I think it might be changing as we speak. As I know, HRA have kind of become more flexible about consent through the pandemic, I think it would be fair to say. I I don't know about the chat function, whether it would be possible to do written consent by that. I think it's worth exploring. It's worth having a close look at the HRA guidance to see what they say. And I think if it's something that you'd be interested in exploring, I think you could ask the question and say, would this be sufficient? I think written consent is probably easier outside of the chat function. I'm just trying to think how it would work in the chat function if you just get people to write their names. I guess the reason verbal consent is sometimes used is because people can state their names and it's recorded. So then you've got that recorded consent. Yeah, it is a bit of a grey area. And I think because we're doing more digitally now, it's kind of something that is being explored in more detail. And also whether, I know some people take consent using questionnaire platforms as well, I think happens. So it could be that that's also something to explore, sending them a link to an online questionnaire potentially before the focus group. Yeah, I don't really have a written handbook. I think it's kind of just looking at the guidance, seeing what's appropriate for your study, and making sure that you set it out in as much detail as possible in your ethics application so that they can then judge whether that's appropriate for the group that you're working with and your study. Yeah, I think that's the best I can give on that one, I'm afraid.
Thank you. And not to put you on the spot, Oliver, at all, but from a kind of rec perspective, is there anything that you can think of off the top of your head to add, or do you think it's kind of context specific and look at the guidance and ask locally? Probably the gist of what we've established.
Yeah, I was hoping you weren't going to ask me actually, because I don't know the answer, and I don't think it is black and white. I think it is context specific. From my point of view, as a research ethics committee member, I would want it to be as convenient for the participant as possible. So that would be my priority. So, I mean, I would be inclined to say, you know, that they've got access to the computer and internet, presumably, if they are able to do a virtual focus group. So I would be, yeah, I would be inclined to say, well, can you do consent virtually, not necessarily verbally, but, you know, virtually written. But you can't always assume that, so you have to have other things in place. And yes, written consent is always, you know, preferred over verbal consent. But yeah, so I can't really give you a definitive answer on that. I might speak to my rec manager about it next time we talk.
Thank you, Oliver. Sorry, I was putting you 100% on the spot there.
Right.
So moving away from consent now, a question, Holly, about structuring your topic guide. So would you structure your focus group topic guide the same way for both face-to-face and virtual focus groups?
Yes, this is a good question. And I think the answer was mostly. So we asked the same topics, we asked the same questions, but we changed the timings depending on whether it was face-to-face or virtual. For example, you know, you might have more time in a face-to-face one because you've got the lunch break and things like that. What I would say is we did take out any possibility of kind of using like post-it notes and like that sort of thing, which we planned on using for the face-to-face initially, but we didn't use that face-to-face anyway. So I think we maybe thought we might have used that face-to-face, but then it didn't kind of happen. But I think we did change the online one to kind of streamline it a bit to make sure that we would cover the topics in as thorough way as possible, given that we were online, but we equally didn't want the participants to be online for too long. So I think we did try to cover the same things, but we did it in a slightly more streamlined way, if that makes sense.
Brilliant, thank you. And then a question about when participants, some people have their camera on, some have them off, and whether this is problematic and how this kind of affects the dynamic.
Yeah, I think my opinion and my perspective on this has always been to ask them whatever they're most comfortable with, just to say you're welcome to have your camera on. We as researchers will have ours on, so you'll be able to see us. But in their way, it's up to them whether they want to put theirs on. Some participants might not have even had cameras. So that might be sort of another point. And also, I think some people feel more comfortable if you can't see them in this sort of environment. And I think that's kind of what I spoke to with the face-to-face versus digital focus groups. A slight difference. There's potentially more anonymity in a digital focus group because they don't have to have their camera on. So I never wanted to pressure anyone into having it on. It didn't really make a huge difference to us, apart from the fact we can't see body language. Which kind of speaks to the thing that I was saying about having to facilitate a bit more to say, you know, Ruth, have you got any comments? What are your thoughts on that? Sylvie, what are your thoughts on that? But also you've got to be careful because of bandwidth and internet issues as well. So I might have okay internet. Sometimes my internet is terrible, but not everyone might have okay internet. So if everybody's relying on their cameras being on as well, it might slow the system down. And that's kind of what I was speaking to about the number of participants in an online focus group as well, because if you kind of crash everyone's computers, then it might not be as kind of conducive anyway. So I think there are lots of considerations there, but I think probably best to give people the option and say it's up to you if you want it on or off. And then us as researchers just have to work with that the best we can and kind of work around that, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And that leads really nicely into a question from Oliver about the fact that, so Oliver's just checked on Google and 70 to 93% of communication is non-verbal. So although you're not necessarily analysing those non-verbal cues, do you think that that's a kind of disadvantage in terms of virtual formats compared to running face-to-face? Because you can't get that kind of non-verbal, just that experience that you would get as a researcher when you're face-to-face.
Yeah, so I think this is a common disadvantage of a lot of research methods. So I've done lots of observational stuff with audio recordings before. And again, it's video recordings versus audio recordings. It's kind of the long-term debate on that and kind of the subtle non-verbal cues that you miss out on if you're observing just audio recordings versus video. I think potentially I'd make the same point that we make there, that sometimes audio recording makes it easier for people. They don't feel like they're under pressure, they don't feel like they can be seen, and sometimes it puts them more at ease. And I think, yes, we are definitely missing out on the non-verbal cues, like you say, as researchers would pick up if somebody's like wanting to get into the conversation or kind of really trying to speak and you can't see that they're trying to speak. That is challenging, and I think it speaks to the skills of us, because I think we have to then do more to make sure that people have the space to speak if they want to. In terms of the non-verbal body language, yeah, you can't see it, but I think then it puts more reliance on what people say. And I think at the start of the focus group, we did say, don't forget, we can't see you if you're like making hand gestures or nodding your head. So please do try and verbalize everything that you kind of want to say or that you think about. We do miss out on that potentially, but I think, you know, pros and cons, and I think it's practicality versus potentially putting people in a position they don't want to be in. And I think that's kind of the main thing for me, that they're comfortable giving the data in the way that they want to give it, rather than us kind of forcing that, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. And I think it kind of contributes to that, the pros and cons thing of that you might actually get people being more open if they feel safer to share, because like you say, there's some level of anonymity and they can kind of relate and discuss. Sylvie?
Thank you. I can't find the raise hand function. I don't know what it is. I was also going to add, there's something about whether you're analyzing that kind of interaction and whether it's, you know, whether it's about you feeling comfortable as a researcher, your participants feeling comfortable, and whether it's going to impact on the overall project. So usually when you are analyzing, unless you're doing a kind of conversation analysis or observational study, you are focusing on the words that people are saying rather than the ways that they're reacting as an analytic mechanism. And so just remembering that one of the advantages of doing remote interviews is being able to create a space in a very particular way and have a facilitated discussion where you can design a lot of the aspects. And so just thinking about that in line with what your project might be and what you want to analyze, rather than thinking you would be able to get that in person anyway. So I just wanted to put that out there too.
That's a good point, and it goes back to what I said right at the start of the presentation. What are you trying to achieve from your focus groups? And if you do need that body language, then maybe, you know, face-to-face might be more appropriate if that is the case, or a video specified interview or whatever. You might have to kind of be a bit more constructed around that if that is important.
Thank you. So I think we've got time for the one last question that's just come through, which is about did you need to specify that participants needed to be in a secure environment, so not in a cafe or somewhere where they could be overheard for confidentiality reasons? And so how did you kind of manage this and make sure that didn't happen?
Yeah, so we again, it was in that email that I said, when you send an email before the focus group, we kind of said, please make sure you're in a quiet environment where you can have sort of these conversations, you know, make sure you're not in a room full of people and all of that sort of stuff. So we didn't prescriptively say, please do not go to a cafe, please be in a private house or whatever, but we did sort of specify the need that they needed to be in a quiet location. And I don't think we had any issues around that. I think it would become quite clear on a focus group if there was lots of noise in the background and things like that. So I don't think we did have any issues with that, but I think it's a really good point. And I think, yeah, it's something we do need to be careful of, and we do need to kind of sort of specify. We can't manage what the participants do and where they do sign in from, but we can sort of give clear expectations up front to say, please do make sure to be in a sort of quiet environment that's, you know, private and people can't overhear you, sort of thing. And again, like I say, we did emphasize at the start of the focus group, in the focus group etiquette part, that they should not share anything outside of the virtual room, as so to speak, so that it's kind of, and we did emphasize that focus groups are difficult for confidentiality because it's not all in the researcher's hands, it's in everybody's hands that's in the room. So I think that's also quite an important conversation to have as well.
Thank you, Holly. So in the interest of time and making sure that we finish promptly and so that everybody can get on with the rest of the day, we will bring the session to a close now. Thank you so much, Holly, for sharing your time, sharing your experience and asking the million questions that we put to you. It was really brilliant and certainly a lot to think about. As we said, we will be sharing the recording and making a summary document available with all the links, all of the papers and any resources that we can find to help you all with adapting your focus groups. And if I can just put a final plea to fill in that feedback form if you can. There are only a couple of questions on there, so just to give us some feedback for our next events. And we will hang around, so if there are any burning questions that you would prefer to ask on a kind of smaller group basis, then please do hang back and we will see what we can do. Thank you.